There are so many directions we could go with today's Torah portion. So many valuable lessons for us as followers of Yeshua. And throughout the Bible, just like today, fear is often manifested through violence and hate, rather than in respect and the wisdom to be at peace. And today we're going to concentrate mainly on the matter that we learn about from Numbers chapter 20. Aaron and Moses go to the wilderness tabernacle and there fall on their faces in worship, seeking the counsel of YHWH, exactly the right thing to do. See, that question is one that plagues believers all of our days. Why is prayer and supplication to the Father often the second, or even perhaps the last, place that we turn in times of need and trouble? I think that the matter primarily comes down to an attitude. Moses and Aaron's penalty for displaying such a haughty attitude and for misleading people into thinking something that is simply not the truth. How could any of us who decline to teach, demonstrate, or live divine truth, and worse, who might try to misappropriate God's glory and merit for ourselves, expect to enter the great spiritual promised land of eternal rest with our Father and His Son? Well, here we read of the recurring issues of the peoples of Israel's dissatisfactions and grumbling against the leadership of Moses, the constant, very real problem of insufficient water, and that people whose land they wanted to cross through to get to Canaan saw Israel as an enemy and a threat, and so attempted to block their way. Now, it can't be said that these other nations worried for no reason. Assuming the Bible is accurate about the size of the group of Israelite refugees, which was likely between 2 and 3 million total, scriptures cite the number of over 600,000 men capable of military duty, and this according to an actual census taken, not an estimate, then indeed leaders of these regions and nations had good reason for concern. Now, not only could a group of that size militarily defeat many long-established nations if they wished to, but in a region where water was scarce, as was grazing land, the monumental daily water needs for Israel would have overwhelmed the available water, which mostly came from wells. Many years ago, it was established that if Israel were 2 million people, they would have needed around 11 million gallons of water every day, especially when you consider that they had large flocks and herds of livestock that also needed water. There are so many directions we could go with today's Torah portion. So many valuable lessons for us as followers of Yeshua. One of them is about the barriers that nations threw up against Israel, which were actually almost entirely fear-based. Although we didn't read this far in Numbers, in chapter 22, we would have encountered this, starting in verse 1. Then the people of Israel traveled on and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Yarden, the Jordan River opposite Jericho. Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was very afraid of the people because there were so many of them. Moab was overcome with dread because of the people of Israel. See, fear is not always an unhealthy thing. Then as today, nations ought to fear Israel for no other reason for their own survival. Not so much for Israel's cleverness and military prowess, but because they belong to God, and they are not to be touched. As we read in today's portion and throughout the Bible, just like today, fear is often manifested through violence and hate, rather than in respect and the wisdom to be at peace with God's people. The Holy Scriptures are full of warning to the nations about this, but few so eloquent as Psalm 2. Why are the nations in an uproar? The people's grumbling in vain. The earth's kings are taking positions, leaders conspiring together against YHWH and his anointed. They cry, let's break their fetters, let's throw off their chains. He who sits in heaven laughs. YHWH looks at them in derision, and then his anger. He rebukes them, terrifies them in his fury. I myself have installed my king on Zion, on my holy mountain. I will proclaim the decree. YHWH said to me, you are my son. Today I became your father. Ask of me. I will make the nations your inheritance. The whole wide world will be your possession. You will break them with an iron rod, shatter them like a clay pot. Therefore, kings, be wise and be warned, you judges on earth. Serve YHWH with fear. Rejoice, but with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish along the way, when suddenly his anger blazes. Oh, how blessed are all who take refuge in him. So while I felt that we needed to be aware of the awareness of other nations about Israel, how large they knew Israel was, and that this fear of them was their primary motivation for denying Israel's passage through their territory, those knee-jerk reactions would bring them to nothing but grief. It remains so in the 21st century. Now that Israel has been reborn as a nation a mere 75 years ago. And today we're going to concentrate mainly on the matter that we learn about from Numbers chapter 20. Now, as we have seen often in the journey of the Israelites, once again, they find themselves in need of water. And when we factor in the needs of 2 to 3 million people plus their large herds and flocks of livestock, the problem simply cannot be solved by discovering merely naturally occurring water sources in the middle of a desert. So once again, they go to Moses, they complain, demand to know what he is going to do about it. And once again, they openly express their distress and unhappiness at being led out into a barren place because despite their lives of oppression in Egypt, from which God rescued them, in Egypt at least they had sufficient food and, more pertinent to this story, plenty of water. I mean, living along the Nile meant they never thirsted for enough water. Now, not knowing what else to do after facing this ungrateful, disgruntled, angry mob, Aaron and Moses go to the wilderness tabernacle and there fall on their faces in worship, seeking the counsel of YHWH, exactly the right thing to do. And not surprisingly, YHWH appears to them and speaks. And the gist of the conversation is that Aaron is to take his rod, that is his staff, that one that budded, walk over to some conspicuous rock formation that was nearby. There they were to assemble the community of Israel as witnesses to what was about to happen. Although opinions differ, I see Israel as now in their 3rd year in the wilderness. They have survived because YHWH has provided them with water, with good tasting and nutritious food that literally falls from the sky in enormous amounts, enough for all. And with no toil or effort on Israel's part except to bring baskets to gather it. Yet the people still grumble and doubt, and many long to go back from where they came. Especially after their awesome experience at the Holy Mountain around 2 years earlier, where God made himself so vividly known to them, why did the Israelites turn in despair to their human leader and not in hopeful expectation through their divine deliverer? See, that question is one that plagues believers all of our days. Why is prayer and supplication to the Father often the second, or even perhaps the last, place that we turn in times of need and trouble? Or that we think it better that we not approach God at all, but rather seek help from someone else first? And while there's no single answer to those questions, I think the underlying fundamental of all the reasons is that despite what we may claim, we don't truly believe nor trust in God in a sincere and authentic way. Those Israelite refugees, despite their universal declaration on Mount Sinai of all that YHWH says we will do, did not believe God to any depth. And yet, we need to be more cautious in drawing too close of a parallel between them and us. In my mind, they had far more excuse for being skeptical concerning God than we do, who have been believers for a few years. This is because we have something they didn't: the hindsight of history. And more importantly, God's Holy Spirit dwelling in us. Those ancient Israelites didn't even know who God was to any substantial level until he sent Moses and delivered them from Egypt. And then a few weeks later at Mount Sinai, YHWH gave them his Torah, his law, their permanent, never-changing, objective moral code for living. And being but a couple of years removed from this seminal moment at Mount Sinai meant that Israel was still in its infancy in knowing who God is by means of their experiences with him. At this time, they were still far more Egyptian than they were set-apart Israel, because just like for us, the transition from being a godless to a godly person is usually a long process and not a single event. They still viewed most things through the lens of their Egyptian historical past. For Israel, Egypt was still the only homeland they had ever known for as much as 20 generations. Canaan, the promised land, was not just remote. It was only a fuzzy theory, a promise that was nearly impossible for them to mentally visualize and internalize as real. See, the reality is it would take 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years of experiencing God's love and care as well as his justice, and of experiencing far more failures in their personal and corporate trials of faith than successes, before YHWH determined they were finally ready enough to receive their promised inheritance, Canaan. Nearly 500 new moons had to pass before these formerly Hebrew Egyptians were reborn as Hebrew Israelites as they passed through the waters of the Jordan River. See, it's a similar life and faith journey of every follower of Yeshua, if we will but recognize it. You know, when we first came to trust in Yeshua, and the several years that followed that moment, the majority of us remained more worldly than becoming more godly. We failed more. We doubted more. At first, we believed less, and we knew less than we would after several more years of seeking after God and trusting in his truths and just plain living life. That is mainly because not enough time had passed yet for us to grow and learn through actual experience. God knows that. He accepts that of us because that is human nature as He created it. However, He expects us to actively work, to grow, mature, correct our ways through acquiring more knowledge and learning from experience as time passes. Therefore, at Meribah, when Moses struck the rock, instead of doing what God commanded, and yet water poured forth, God did not punish or chastise young, inexperienced Israel for their lack of faith. Rather, He punished Moses and his brother Aaron, whom He had specially prepared, in whom He had directly instructed about what to do, but who also failed. See, a growing faith is reflected by a growing trust and belief in what the Father instructs. And that growing trust and belief is reflected not by our mere words, but rather by the decisions we make, the actions we take. Yeshua's brother James addressed this exact issue as he addresses those who claim to have faith in Messiah Yeshua, but behave quite differently. In James 2, verse 14, he says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone claims to have faith, but he has no actions to prove it? Is such faith able to save him?" Moving to verse 20, "But foolish fellow, do you want to be shown that such faith apart from actions is barren?" So with some honest introspection, we have to ask. We each have to ask, does my life actually reflect my claimed trust in Yeshua? And considering the times in which we live, do you sense and really believe that the end times have probably arrived or is so very near, but perhaps you've done little, if anything, of actual spiritual and tangible value to prepare for it? Have you taken practical steps to provide for your family when food and other supplies needed for basic life suddenly become scarce, as is prophesied to happen? If, my friend, you have not, you have to ask yourself if you truly do believe what you claim you believe. And not just James, but also Paul and nearly every other inspired Bible writer states without wavering, true trust must be accompanied with relevant action, or it's not actual trust. It more resembles self-deception. I want to give you an example of what I'm getting at. If you were told that a terrorist has planted a nuclear bomb in your community and it's set to go off at noon tomorrow, there is no hope in finding it and stopping it, would you pack up and leave as quickly as you could, leaving behind almost all you had? But by quickly leaving, it would save you and your family's lives. Or would you go right on living as before, kind of waiting to see if what you were told actually happens? Still going to work, your children still going to school. Few here would likely ignore such a warning because you actually do believe. It's entirely possible, even if you're a little skeptical, you would indeed take action, leave as quickly as possible, because the not doing so and then the bomb going off is just too gruesome to contemplate. Trust plus action is the definition of what the Bible means to believe. just as to listen plus an appropriate response of action is the true biblical definition of hearing. Moses did as he was told by God because he trusted God, but even that trust was imperfect. He took the rod, he went to the rock, and then it proceeded to speak harshly to the people. Basically, he says, you always come griping to me. You expect me to handle everything for you. Somehow or another, even in a place where there's no water, I'm supposed to just manufacture it for you. Fix these problems as though I made them in the first place. Then he turned and he waxed the rock with Aaron's staff twice, and out flowed enormous volumes of water. The people were certainly happy enough about what happened, but it turns out that God didn't feel the same way about it. He informs Moses and Aaron that because they did not affirm God's sanctity in front of the Israelite community, that neither of them will enter the promised land. We have no record of a response or reaction from Moses or Aaron. Yet one can only imagine their shock and depression at this immovable edict from God. Anyone studying this might want to ask himself, why? Why such a harsh decree from the Father to the very two men whom he has used and to some degree used up to achieve his purposes? What is it exactly that Moses and Aaron did that would bring this sort of wrath from God upon them? Well, the obvious is that Moses disobeyed God. He hit the rock that he was only supposed to verbally command to produce water, even though in a previous incident, hitting the rock to produce water is what he was told to do. And even so, from our human viewpoint, this seems so small a thing in comparison to the drastic consequences. In God's eyes, however, their offense was very serious. In Deuteronomy, in recalling this event, we read this from Deuteronomy 32, starting in verse 49. Go up into the Avarim range to Mount Nebo in the land of Moab across from Jericho, and look out over the land of Canaan, which I am giving the people of Israel as a possession. On the mountain you are ascending, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. And the reason for this is that you both broke faith with me there among the people of Israel at Meravat Kadesh Spring and in the Tzin Desert. You failed to demonstrate my holiness there among the people of Israel. So you will see the land from a distance, but you will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. See, in truth, there have been many theories put forth by great Jewish scholars over the centuries to explain this devastating divine retribution upon Moses and Aaron. And among those theories are these, that in striking the rock, he struck it twice instead of once, but this is based on a belief that the two mentions in the Torah of Moses obtaining water from a rock are actually only one. And another view is that his ungodly character flaws were displayed. A blazing temper caused Moses to care little for the very real need of the people, water, and thus saw the matter as mostly a bother to him personally. Yet another is that he doubted God, and thus God told him exactly that, because you did not trust in me. And of course, the most accepted explanation is they struck the rock instead of speaking to it as ordered by God. So how are we to understand this? I think that the matter primarily comes down to an attitude that Moses displayed in front of Israel, in which, unintentionally or not, he used and validated a pagan belief held by those Israelites that was the same as all people of that era. And in doing so, failed to show God as the one who brings forth the water. not a man. See, we must remember that Israel was but 2 or so years removed from Egypt. They behaved and thought more as Egyptians than Israelites. Deep-seated in their consciousness was the acceptance of magic and of sorcerers, men who possessed special powers that were loaned to them by the gods. The sorcerers invariably made quite a show of it, using incantations and all sorts of dramatic gestures when they did their magic. And naturally, these magicians were greatly feared and revered for the powers they claimed to possess. Moses and Aaron essentially took credit for the miracle of the water coming forth from the rock. In fact, in the way they behaved, they implied it by their power that this amazing thing happened. Verse 10 says, "Listen here, you rebels, are we, Moses and Aaron, supposed to bring you water from this rock?" Then Moses struck the rock and the water gushed forth. I mean, what else were the people to think but that it was Moses and Aaron that had great supernatural powers? Some of the ancient Hebrews sages say that the great sin resulted from Moses saying, "Notzi," meaning, "shall we draw forth?" When what he should have said is "Yotzi," meaning, "shall he draw forth?" By saying "Notzi," Moses was given credit to he and Aaron as though they had the power of sorcerers to call forth water from a rock, instead of directing all honor and glory to YHWH, who is the one with the power. Now, the result of this rash public indiscretion is that it reflected badly on God. Thus, the way we should read it in chapter 20, verse 12 is, "But YHWH said to Moshe and Aharon, because you did not trust in me, so as to cause me to be regarded as holy by the people of Israel." See, the water being miraculously provided for the people from an inert rock should have been yet another opportunity for God to display his mercy and love and unlimited ability to care for his own, as well as his immutable uniqueness, apart from men or other gods. I mean, the sanctity and glory that should have been his alone became muddled in the minds of all those who could have benefited greatly from the lesson that among the Hebrews there will be no sorcery or sorcerers. But Israel's leaders failed. And when leaders fail, the consequences upon them all is all the greater. God wanted to show that he stood alone, distinct, apart from any other being, and demonstrate his love and concern for Israel. But instead, Moses and Aaron attempted to show themselves as being distinct and apart from Israel. They showed themselves as inherently possessing many of the powers of YHWH. And since God was denied his due in the miracle of the water from the rock, Moses and Aaron would be denied their due from being the leaders of Israel. For when verse 12 is completed, it says, "You will not bring this community into the land I've given to them." And what a huge warning this is, especially to those who hold ourselves up as God's representatives and leaders of his congregations of believers on earth. How many pastors and rabbis and teachers and prophets claim or imply a power and special ability or holiness of their own to be used at their own discretion, when in fact we have no inherent power or special holiness. Or they claim personal credit for what actually are acts of God. You know, some time ago, I heard a TV pastor who was trolling for funds for his ministry say that if people would send him $1,000 that he would covenant with them and vow a threefold return in their investment in his ministry. He was proudly saying he had the spiritual power to cause God to miraculously give you back 3,000 if you sent 1,000 to support his ministry. I want to be very clear on this crucial lesson from our divine Lord. Moses and Aaron's penalty for displaying such a haughty attitude and for misleading people into thinking something that is simply not the truth, for trying to rob God of his due glory, they were never allowed to enter into the promised land. If men of such great position and stature, men who were afforded by God with the highest level of holiness the humans could ever achieve on earth, if even they were not allowed entry into the promised land because of the type of sin they committed, even if to them the offense was small, how could any of us who decline to teach, demonstrate, or live divine truth, and worse, who might try to misappropriate God's glory and merit for ourselves, expect to enter the great spiritual promised land of eternal rest with our Father and his Son? It ought to be enough for us all, that God loves us. He hears our prayers. He shows us his mercy in marvelous ways every day. He acts on our behalf probably more than we realize. Even Yeshua, our Messiah, who himself was divine, never attempted to misappropriate to his own glory that which belonged to his Father. He ascribed all of his miracles, his accomplishments, what he knew, what he was sent to do, to his Father. He directed all prayers, all praise to his Father. Then Yeshua left this earth telling his disciples, us, to be like him. Well, let us together determine to do just that.
For more teaching and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship. Here at The Seed, enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.